The night air hung heavy over the Pacific island. Staff Sergeant James Mitchell crouched behind a palm tree, his rifle steady despite the trembling in his hands. It was his third week on Guadalcanal, and he'd already learned that the jungle never truly slept. It watched, it waited. And somewhere out there, beyond the thin line of American positions, the enemy watched too. Mitchell's unit had been given a seemingly impossible task: hold a section of perimeter with just 12 men against an enemy that could strike from any direction at any time. The young sergeant knew that conventional sentries would never be enough. One moment of distraction, 1 second of drowsiness, and the entire position could be compromised before anyone could sound the alarm. What Mitchell and thousands of soldiers like him developed during those desperate nights would become one of the most effective yet forgotten defensive tactics of the Second World War. A system so elegantly simple that modern security experts are rediscovering its principles today. A method that turned the very environment into a guardian that never blinked, never tired, and never failed to sound the alarm. This is the story of the perimeter detection systems that saved countless lives during the war. Systems that were refined in the crucible of combat across multiple theaters, from the jungles of the Pacific to the hedgerows of Normandy, from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen forests of the Ardennes. The concept wasn't entirely new. Soldiers throughout history had used basic warning systems: bells on strings, piles of dry leaves that crackled underfoot, even geese that would honk at intruders. But what made the World War II iteration revolutionary was how it combined multiple layers of detection into an integrated defensive network that could protect an entire position with minimal manpower. The story truly begins in the early months of 1942, when Allied forces found themselves stretched impossibly thin across the Pacific. After the devastating losses at Pearl Harbor and the subsequent Japanese advances, American and Commonwealth troops were fighting a defensive war with resources that never seemed adequate for the task at hand. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson of the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion had spent time in China before the war, observing communist guerrilla tactics against the Japanese. He recognized that the Chinese soldiers, often vastly outnumbered and poorly equipped, had developed ingenious methods for defending their positions. They understood that the key to perimeter security wasn't just about watching the approaches, it was about making the approaches themselves work as sentries. Carlson began experimenting with what his Marines would come to call the noise net. The principle was devastatingly simple. Instead of relying solely on human vigilance, which could fail at the worst possible moment, you created a web of sound triggers that would announce any movement toward your position. The most basic version used empty ration tins partially filled with pebbles or spent cartridge cases. These were suspended on tripwires at irregular intervals around the defensive perimeter. The key word there is irregular. A pattern could be studied, learned, and eventually defeated. Randomness was protection. But here's where the tactic became truly sophisticated. The noise net wasn't just about making sound. It was about creating layers of different sounds at different distances. Close to the perimeter, you might have the tin cans. Further out, you'd have something subtler, perhaps thin wire that would scrape against bamboo, creating a softer rustle that a trained ear could distinguish from natural jungle sounds. And furthest out, you'd have what the Marines called the whisper line. This consisted of the thinnest fishing line or thread, barely visible even in daylight, strung between vegetation at ankle height. Anyone moving through the area would inevitably brush against it, and the vibration would travel along the line to bells or other sensitive indicators at the defensive position. The genius of this system lay in its redundancy. An alert infiltrator might detect and carefully step over the first tripwire. They might even spot and avoid the second. But the third, fourth, and fifth layers, each different from the last, each requiring different awareness and counter tactics, became almost impossible to defeat in darkness. Private First Class Robert Leckie, whose wartime memoirs would later become famous, wrote about his first encounter with a well-constructed noise net on Guadalcanal. He described approaching what he thought was an empty clearing, only to realize after several careful steps that he was surrounded by an invisible web of detection devices. The realization, he wrote, was like suddenly seeing a spider's web in morning dew, except this web was designed to catch men, not insects. The tactic spread rapidly throughout the Pacific Theater as word passed from unit to unit, but each environment required adaptation. What worked in the dense jungle of Guadalcanal needed modification for the coral atolls of Tarawa or the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima. On Tarawa, where vegetation was sparse, Marines developed what they called the rock garden. They would arrange loose stones and coral fragments in carefully designed patterns around their positions. The patterns looked random, but were actually precisely engineered. Any disturbance of the rocks would create a cascade effect, a small avalanche that would announce an intruder's presence. The sound, to a trained defender, was unmistakable. It had a particular rhythm, a specific tone that was different from the natural settling of rocks or the scurrying of the abundant land crabs that populated the atoll. Veterans could distinguish between a crab the size of a dinner plate moving across the rocks and a man trying to move silently. The difference was in the pattern of displacement and the timing of the sounds. Meanwhile, across the world in North Africa, British and Commonwealth forces were developing their own variations of perimeter detection. The desert presented unique challenges and opportunities. There was little vegetation for attachment points, but the sand itself became an asset. Captain David Sterling of the Special Air Service documented a technique that his desert raiders used when establishing temporary bases deep behind enemy lines. They would rake the sand in specific patterns around their perimeter, creating what appeared to be natural wind patterns. But these patterns were actually designed to amplify sound. Footsteps on the textured sand would create a distinctive crunching that carried surprisingly far in the still desert air. More sophisticated was what the long-range desert group called sand singing. They discovered that certain combinations of sand grain sizes and surface textures, when disturbed, would create a low-frequency hum or vibration. By carefully preparing approaches to their positions with the right sand mixtures, they could create zones where movement was audibly announced, sometimes from remarkable distances. But the most elaborate development of perimeter detection tactics came from an unlikely source: the German forces defending occupied Europe. As the war progressed and Allied bombing campaigns intensified, German defensive positions had to be maintained with increasingly limited manpower. Necessity drove innovation. The Germans developed what they called Alarmglocken system, or alarm bell system, but it was far more sophisticated than the name suggests. It incorporated multiple sensory triggers: sound, yes, but also vibration, light reflection, and even scent. Documents captured after D-Day revealed the extent of German perimeter defensive theory. Wehrmacht training manuals from 1943 describe a multi-layered approach that bears striking similarity to modern motion detection systems, except executed entirely through mechanical and analog means. The outer layer consisted of what they termed Kontaktlinien, or contact lines. These were thin wires strung through underbrush and connected to bells housed in sound amplification boxes. The boxes were positioned to project sound back toward defensive positions while muffling it from the direction of approach. An infiltrator might not hear the bell they'd just triggered, but the defenders certainly would. The second layer used Vibrationsdetektoren, vibration detectors. These were remarkably simple: wooden stakes driven into the ground and connected by taut wire to suspended metal plates inside protective housings. Any significant vibration from movement or digging would cause the plates to rattle. Each detector covered a specific arc, and the pattern of which detectors activated would tell defenders both the direction and approximate distance of movement. The third layer incorporated light. Not electric light, which required precious batteries or generators, but phosphorescent paint. Stakes and markers were painted with luminescent material that would glow faintly in darkness. Tripwires were also treated with this paint at irregular intervals. An infiltrator attempting to cut a wire would create a distinctive break in the faint glow pattern, immediately visible to observers who had dark-adapted their vision. The fourth and perhaps most ingenious layer used scent. German defenders would place small containers of strong-smelling substances like anise oil, synthetic musk, or camphor along approach routes. These were positioned to require contact or close passage. The idea was that an infiltrator would unknowingly carry the scent with them, marking them for defenders and tracking dogs, even if they successfully breached the perimeter undetected by other means. After the Allied breakout from Normandy, combat engineers studying captured German positions were astounded by the sophistication of these systems. A report filed by the First Army's Engineering Section in August 1944 noted that some German defensive perimeters in Bocage country had detection systems with 7 distinct layers, each using different principles and requiring different countermeasures. American forces began incorporating German innovations into their own defensive doctrine, but they also drew on their Pacific experience, creating hybrid systems that reflected lessons from both theaters. In the winter of 1944, as Allied forces pushed toward Germany, the ancient forests of the Ardennes became the testing ground for these evolved tactics. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive, saw both sides using sophisticated perimeter detection methods in dense forest conditions. American positions in the Ardennes often used what soldiers called the Forest Symphony. This was a comprehensive system that turned the snowy woods into an early warning network. The first component was simple: snow-covered tripwires that were almost invisible against the white ground, but would create distinctive disturbances when triggered, sending cascades of snow from overhanging branches. The second component used the forest itself. Soldiers would partially saw through tree branches at specific heights and angles. The branches remained attached but were weakened. A brush against them would cause them to crack with a sound that carried through the cold air. The pattern of cracks would indicate the direction and speed of movement through the forest. The third component was perhaps the most creative: frozen water. Soldiers would fill their empty ration tins with water and place them in shallow depressions in the snow along approaches to positions. The water would freeze, creating small ice lenses. Anyone stepping on these would crack them with a distinctive sound completely different from simply crunching through snow. Moreover, the broken ice would leave clear evidence of the intrusion route visible even in darkness with the faint light of snow reflection. Sergeant William True of the 106th Infantry Division described the sound of the Forest Symphony during the initial German assault on December 16th. He wrote that he first heard what sounded like ice breaking, then the crack of prepared branches, and finally the cascade of snow from disturbed tripwires. The system gave his platoon precious seconds of warning before German stormtroopers emerged from the pre-dawn darkness. Those seconds saved lives. True's platoon, despite being massively outnumbered, was able to mount an organized resistance instead of being caught completely unprepared. They eventually had to withdraw, but they'd bought time for forces behind them to prepare defenses. The Italian campaign presented yet another environment requiring adaptation. In the mountains, sound behaved differently. Echoes could be misleading. The solution developed by mountain troops was the altitude ladder. This system used the natural amphitheater effect of mountain valleys. Detection devices were placed at different elevations along approach routes. The timing of alerts from different altitude layers would not only indicate that someone was approaching, but also their approximate elevation and speed of ascent or descent. A rapidly ascending infiltrator would trigger sensors in a different pattern than someone moving laterally across the slope. Polish forces fighting at Monte Cassino refined this technique further. They incorporated natural rockfall zones into their defensive planning. Carefully placed triggers would initiate small, controlled slides of loose rock that served both to alert defenders and to potentially impede attackers without requiring direct engagement. But perimeter detection wasn't just about alerting defenders to infiltrators, it was also psychological warfare. A skilled defensive commander could use the system to manipulate enemy behavior. The Japanese in the Pacific became notorious for what Allied soldiers called noise discipline. They trained extensively in moving silently through detection zones, but American defenders learned to use this against them. They would deliberately create gaps in their noise net, apparent weak points in the defensive perimeter. Japanese infiltrators, recognizing these gaps, would naturally gravitate toward them. But the gaps were actually channeling zones. They funneled approaching enemy troops into predetermined killing zones that were covered by carefully positioned machine guns and mortars. The quiet approach became a trap. Lieutenant John Hawk of the 1st Cavalry Division described this tactic in action on Leyte in the Philippines. His company commander had established what appeared to be a poorly defended section of perimeter with obvious gaps in the noise net. Japanese forces probed these gaps on 3 consecutive nights, and each time were caught in devastating crossfire from concealed positions. By the 4th night, Japanese commanders recognized the trap and began attacking the most heavily defended and noisy sections of the American perimeter, apparently reasoning that these represented the real defensive line. But this, too, was anticipated. The noisy sections were deliberately overbuilt with redundant detection layers, but fewer actual defenders. The result was that Japanese forces committed to difficult frontal assaults against prepared positions, while the Americans had concentrated their infantry elsewhere. This psychological dimension of perimeter defense became increasingly sophisticated as the war progressed. Both sides engaged in what intelligence officers called security theater, creating elaborate detection systems designed not just to detect, but to deceive, to shape enemy planning and exhaust enemy resources. In the Pacific, some Marine units established what they called living perimeters. These incorporated actual living creatures into the detection network. Land crabs, which were abundant on many islands, had predictable behavioral patterns. They would scatter or go silent when larger animals or humans approached. Marines learned to read these patterns. A sudden silence in normally noisy crab populations indicated something was disturbing them. Similarly, certain bird species had alarm calls that differed from their normal vocalizations. Troops stationed in jungle environments for extended periods learned to distinguish these alarm calls and incorporated them into their defensive awareness. The jungle itself became an ally, but perhaps the most remarkable development in perimeter tactics came in the war's final year, when Allied forces began planning for the invasion of Japan. Intelligence suggested that Japanese defenders would employ fanatical defensive measures and that securing beachheads would require new approaches to perimeter security. The Office of Strategic Services, working with combat engineers and infantry tacticians, developed what was codenamed the Barrier Protocol. This was essentially a modular perimeter detection system that could be rapidly deployed from landing craft and established within minutes of securing a beach. The system used prefabricated detection units that could be quickly assembled. Each unit contained multiple detection modalities: pressure plates made from salvaged bomb fins, bells on springs that could be thrust into sand or soft ground, and even primitive photocell devices that used captured German technology. The photocells were particularly innovative. They used small sealed units with photosensitive material that, when exposed to sudden changes in light levels, like a flashlight or muzzle flash, would trigger a mechanical alarm. These could be set up along a perimeter to detect nighttime movement even without physical contact. The barrier protocol was field-tested in the invasion of Okinawa. After-action reports indicate that it was remarkably effective. Perimeter security was established in a fraction of the time previously required, and the detection rate for infiltration attempts exceeded 90%. But Okinawa also revealed a weakness in even the most sophisticated perimeter systems. Japanese defenders, fighting on their own territory with intimate knowledge of the terrain, developed countermeasures. They used natural features like limestone cave systems to bypass surface detection networks entirely, emerging behind Allied lines from underground. This led to the development of what engineers called volumetric defense, extending perimeter security into 3 dimensions. This included monitoring for underground movement through seismographic listening posts and aerial approaches through acoustic detection of aircraft engines. The acoustic detection systems deserve their own study. Troops learned to distinguish between the sound of American engines and Japanese engines, not just by tone, but by synchronization. American radial engines in aircraft like the Corsair or Hellcat had distinctive firing orders. Japanese engines sounded different. This auditory signature recognition allowed defenders to identify friendly or enemy aircraft by sound alone, often before they were visible. Ground troops used similar principles. The sound of tracked vehicles could be distinguished from wheeled vehicles. American tanks sounded different from German panzers or Japanese light tanks. Diesel engines had different acoustic signatures from gasoline engines. A trained ear could identify not just that vehicles were approaching, but what type and approximately how many. This acoustic intelligence became integrated into perimeter defense. Listening posts, often just soldiers with good hearing positioned in forward positions, became critical nodes in the defensive network. They would use simple field telephones to relay information about approaching threats based entirely on sound analysis. The British took this furthest with their development of what they called sound-ranging positions. These used multiple listening posts in geometric arrangements. By comparing the timing of sound arrival at different positions, operators could triangulate the location and movement of enemy forces with surprising accuracy, sometimes to within 100 meters, even in darkness or poor visibility. After the war ended, these perimeter detection tactics largely disappeared from military doctrine. The Cold War brought new technologies, electronic sensors, radar, infrared detection. The elegant analog systems developed through desperate necessity seemed obsolete. But they weren't forgotten entirely. Veterans returned home carrying this knowledge. Some found unexpected applications for it in civilian life. Forest rangers adapted tripwire and sound detection methods for monitoring wilderness areas. Security consultants incorporated principles of layered detection into protection systems for facilities and estates. In the 1960s, during the Vietnam conflict, some of these WWII era tactics resurfaced. Special forces teams operating in jungle environments rediscovered the value of noise nets and layered perimeter systems when electronic devices failed or their batteries died. They found that the old analog methods, while less sophisticated than modern electronics, were reliable, required no power source, and were virtually impossible to defeat electronically. A Green Beret captain named James Rogers wrote a field manual in 1967 that essentially rediscovered and systematized the perimeter tactics developed 25 years earlier. He'd served with veterans who'd fought in the Pacific and had learned their techniques. Rogers adapted these methods for Vietnam's unique environment, creating hybrid systems that combined the electronic sensors with traditional noise nets. But it was in the post-Cold War era that the true value of these forgotten tactics would become apparent. As military budgets tightened and forces found themselves deployed in remote locations without reliable power infrastructure, there was renewed interest in low-tech, high-reliability security systems. conservation organizations protecting wildlife preserves in Africa and Asia began using adapted versions of WWII perimeter tactics to detect poachers. The principles remained the same: multiple layers, varied detection methods, irregular patterns, and integration with the natural environment. A wildlife ranger in Kenya named Joseph Kimani described how his team used modified noise nets around elephant populations to detect poaching gangs. The system used solar-charged electronic sensors in key locations, but these were backed up by simple mechanical devices based on WWII principles. When poachers learned to evade the electronic sensors, they still triggered the mechanical backups. Perhaps most remarkably, some of the original WWII perimeter systems remained in place and functional decades after the war. In the Philippines, local communities living near former battlegrounds discovered that Japanese defensive positions still had operational tripwire systems in the jungle. The bells had long since rusted away, but the basic structure of the perimeter net was intact. In the Solomon Islands, a survey team in the 1990s found American defensive positions where marine noise nets were still strung between trees. The tin cans long rotted away, but the wire framework preserved by the constant maintenance of new vegetation growing through it, essentially keeping the system alive through natural processes. These discoveries sparked interest among military historians and security professionals. Research teams began systematically documenting the perimeter tactics used in different theaters of WWII. What emerged was a comprehensive picture of sophisticated defensive theory that had been largely forgotten in the rush toward technological solutions. Modern security experts began recognizing that the WWII's perimeter tactics addressed fundamental problems that technology hadn't entirely solved. Electronic sensors could be jammed or spoofed. They required power. They could be defeated by someone with the right equipment and knowledge, but a well-designed noise net, layered and irregular, was almost impossible to defeat silently. The key insight was redundancy through simplicity. Instead of one sophisticated system that could fail or be defeated, you created multiple simple systems, each independent, each requiring different countermeasures. The cumulative effect was a defensive network that was greater than the sum of its parts. In the 21st century, this principle found new expression in what security professionals call defense in depth. Modern perimeter security for high-value facilities now routinely combines electronic sensors with physical barriers and acoustic detection devices. The electronic sensors are the primary system, but the low-tech backups provide redundancy. Some military bases and installations have actually reintroduced noise nets as supplements to electronic security. After incidents where determined intruders defeated electronic perimeters, security planners recognized that the old analog methods provided a layer of protection that was both cost-effective and reliable. A security consultant named Michael Torres, who specializes in protecting remote facilities, has become an evangelist for what he calls hybrid security architecture. His systems combine modern electronics with adapted WWII perimeter tactics. He argues that many facilities over-rely on technology and neglect the fundamental principles of layered, multimodal detection. Torres points out that most perimeter breaches occur not because intruders are particularly skilled, but because security systems have single points of failure. An electronic sensor can malfunction, a camera can be blinded, a guard can be distracted, but a properly designed noise net, requiring no power and no maintenance, provides continuous protection. He's adapted the WWII tactics for modern contexts. Instead of tin cans and pebbles, he uses lightweight polymer materials and carefully calibrated acoustic triggers. Instead of fishing line and bells, he uses fiber optic cables that transmit vibrations to central monitoring stations. But the fundamental principles remain those developed in the jungles of Guadalcanal and the forests of the Ardennes. The psychological aspects of WWII perimeter tactics have also found new applications. Security planners now routinely incorporate elements designed to shape intruder behavior, channeling them into detection zones or creating uncertainty that slows their advance. This psychological dimension was understood intuitively by WWII soldiers, but is now studied systematically. Research in environmental psychology and criminal behavior has validated what those combat veterans knew, that uncertainty is a powerful deterrent and that visible security measures, even simple ones, significantly affect intruder decision-making. A noise net visible to someone conducting reconnaissance of a facility sends a message. This place is defended by people who understand security, who have thought through their defensive needs, who are likely to have additional measures you cannot see. The psychological impact often exceeds the purely tactical value. This brings us back to that night on Guadalcanal, to Staff Sergeant Mitchell, crouching behind his palm tree. The system he helped develop that night, improvising with materials at hand and drawing on techniques passed down from more experienced Marines, represented applied genius born of necessity. Mitchell's noise net consisted of 5 layers. The outermost was fishing line strung ankle high, connected to bells fashioned from spent shell casings. 20 yards closer, he'd suspended ration tins filled with coral pebbles on tripwires at varying heights. 15 yards from his position, he'd woven together a grid of thin wire that would catch on equipment or clothing. 10 yards out, he'd prepared branches that would crack when disturbed. And immediately around his position, he'd scattered loose items that would clatter if kicked. That night, Japanese infiltrators attempted to reach American lines. Mitchell heard them coming long before they were visible. First, the soft ring of bells from the outer perimeter. Then silence as the infiltrators paused, trying to determine if they'd been detected. Then the rattle of tin cans as they continued forward, believing the first trigger had been unheard or insignificant. Mitchell's unit held their fire, following doctrine. Let the enemy commit. Let them enter the killing zone. The sound of wire scraping against equipment, the crack of prepared branches, and finally, movement visible in the darkness. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. When dawn broke, the defensive position was secure. Mitchell's improvised perimeter system had provided the early warning that made the difference between prepared defenders and surprised victims. Multiply that one small action by thousands of similar positions across multiple theaters of war, and you begin to understand the cumulative impact of these perimeter tactics. They don't appear in the dramatic narratives of WWII because they're not about heroic charges or decisive battles. They're about the unglamorous work of staying alive through another night, of maintaining defensive integrity with limited resources, of solving practical problems with creative thinking. The tactics developed by Mitchell, and thousands like him, represent a body of practical knowledge refined through the harshest possible testing. They solved real problems in resource-constrained environments where failure meant immediate consequences, and because they addressed fundamental challenges of perimeter security rather than being tied to any specific technology, their core principles remain relevant. Today, whether you're a wildlife ranger in Africa protecting elephants from poaching gangs, a security consultant designing protection for a remote research station, or a homeowner in a rural area concerned about property security, the principles of WWII perimeter tactics offer proven solutions. The key lessons are universal. First, detection should be layered. No single system is perfect, but multiple independent systems create redundancy that's difficult to defeat. Second, use multiple detection modalities: sound, vibration, visual changes, even scent. Each requires different countermeasures, and defeating all simultaneously is exponentially more difficult than defeating one. Third, embrace irregularity. Patterns can be studied and defeated. Randomness within structure creates uncertainty that works in the defender's favor. Fourth, integrate with the environment. Use natural features and materials. Make the environment itself part of your security system. Fifth, consider the psychological dimension. Visible security measures affect behavior and decision-making. Sometimes preventing an intrusion attempt is better than detecting one in progress. Sixth, plan for failure. Assume that any one layer of your security can be defeated and ensure that deeper layers remain effective. And seventh, maintain simplicity in components even as you build complexity in system architecture. Each individual detection device should be simple, reliable, and require minimal maintenance. The sophistication comes from how these simple devices are combined and deployed. These principles, forged in the desperate circumstances of global conflict, transcend their military origins. They represent solutions to fundamental problems of security and detection that remain relevant regardless of technological advancement. The soldiers who developed these tactics weren't engineers or security specialists. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, solving problems with whatever materials were at hand. Their innovations weren't recorded in formal documents or training manuals, at least not initially. They spread through informal networks, shared between units, refined through trial and error. Many of the men who developed and perfected these techniques never knew that their innovations would outlast the war. They were focused on immediate survival, on protecting their comrades, on getting through one more night. That their practical solutions would still be relevant 80 years later would have seemed unimaginable. Yet here we are, in an age of electronic sensors and artificial intelligence, still finding value in the principles they developed, not because modern technology has failed, but because the fundamental challenges of perimeter security remain unchanged. You need to detect intrusion attempts. You need to do so reliably. You need systems that work in various conditions, and you need to accomplish this efficiently with limited resources. The WWII perimeter tactics provide a framework for thinking about these challenges. They remind us that sophisticated doesn't always mean complex, that reliability often comes from simplicity, and that the best security systems work with the environment rather than trying to impose artificial solutions upon it. As we face new security challenges in an increasingly uncertain world, there's value in looking back at what worked in the past, not to simply copy old solutions, but to understand the principles that made them effective. The noise nets of Guadalcanal and the sound ranges of the Ardennes were products of their time, but the thinking behind them is timeless. Staff Sergeant Mitchell survived the war. He returned home to a small town in Oregon, became a teacher, and rarely spoke about his combat experiences. But in a letter written late in his life to a historian researching Pacific Theater defensive tactics, he reflected on those nights maintaining the perimeter. He wrote that what he remembered most wasn't the fear or the danger, but the satisfaction of solving problems, of taking whatever was available and making it work, of protecting his men through preparation and planning rather than just courage and firepower. He'd been a good student in school, he wrote, but the war taught him how to think creatively under pressure, how to see solutions where others saw only obstacles. That creative problem-solving, multiplied across millions of soldiers in countless situations, generated innovations that extended far beyond their immediate military applications. The perimeter tactics were just one example. Simple, practical, effective solutions to real problems. Today, when we rediscover these forgotten tactics, we're not just recovering historical curiosities. We're reconnecting with a tradition of practical innovation that solved difficult problems with limited resources. We're learning from people who couldn't rely on advanced technology or unlimited budgets, who had to make do with what was available and make it work because lives depended on it. The perimeter tactics of World War II remind us that the best security systems aren't necessarily the most technologically advanced. They're the ones that work reliably, that address fundamental needs, that continue functioning when other systems fail. They're the ones that combine multiple approaches, that create layers of protection, that turn the environment itself into an ally. As we continue developing new security technologies, there's wisdom in remembering these principles. In combining the old and the new, the simple and the sophisticated, we create systems that are more robust, more reliable, and more effective than either approach alone. The noise nets may be silent now, the tin cans rusted away, the tripwires long since dissolved. But the thinking behind them, the creative problem-solving and practical innovation remains as relevant as ever. In a world that often seeks complex solutions to every problem, the WWII perimeter tactics remind us that sometimes the best answer is elegant simplicity, carefully applied. And perhaps that's the real lesson of these forgotten tactics, not the specific techniques, though those remain useful, but the mindset that created them, a mindset that saw problems as opportunities for innovation, that valued effectiveness over complexity, that understood the power of simple things done well. That mindset built defenses that protected countless lives. It created security systems that worked when they were needed most. And it left us lessons that still resonate today, reminding us that the best solutions often come not from the most advanced technology, but from clear thinking, creative application, and a deep understanding of fundamental principles. The lost WWII perimeter tactics aren't truly lost. They're waiting to be rediscovered, adapted, and applied to modern challenges. They're a reminder that history isn't just about remembering the past, but learning from it. And they're a testament to the ingenuity of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, solving problems that would outlast the war that created them.